Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Exercise Mechanic Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking all about, are there movement prerequisites that potentiate performance and or decrease pain? I'm joined by Brett Patterson. What up, man? How you doing?
I'm great.
Yeah,
I feel a little lonely, maybe a little bit more like romantic than we normally are, without old Ryan third wheel here.
yeah, that's right. Not as romantic as our coffee date that we had the other
Yeah,
day,
that's true.
but definitely more romantic than the typical three-way podcast.
That place was really nice, by the way. Shout out to Ten Toes Coffee on Searville. Like I don't know. The decor was like classic and kind of cottagey, and the
Agreed.
house that I grew up in was very much that. And between that and like the smells, every once in a while you'd get like a waft of like cinnamon through the place and fresh coffee, and it just like felt so homey and nice.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and also, I mean, as you know, it was kind of funny. I ran into like five different people that I hadn't seen in a long time. But shout out to Ro, who's I believe, the manager over there, and she really took good care of us. And
Mhm.
but yeah, I agree. 10 Toes on Searville. For those that are in Ottawa, check it out. It's surrounded by construction, but inside it's nice and cozy. With regards to today's conversation, we're going to be talking about, like I mentioned at the beginning, are there any, I guess, objective prerequisites that people need to have for sport performance to mitigate against the risk of injury and or decrease pain. So we're going to dig into all of that. We're also going to be talking about, is there a relationship between one's mobility as well as pain and injury? We can talk about that today. But before we dig into that, what are your initial thoughts on this, Brett? Like when it comes to the relationship between performance and pain and specific movement prerequisites, what's your take?
I don't know if I necessarily agree with like you need to be able to do like a like movement, like this is a particular closed loop. You need to be able to do this thing before you're allowed to even attempt this thing. Like that kind of strictness is a little bit harsh, I feel. I think there are kind of
Can you give an example just real quick? Like, what would be an
yeah,
example of that?
so here's one that I heard from a ski coach a long time ago is that you need to be able to do a pistol squat to be a ski racer.
Hmm.
And like there's a lot of strength and balance involved in a pistol squat. It's certainly a great exercise, and if you can perform it as a ski racer, I think that's a huge benefit. But there's a lot of parts of it, like, you know, for a lot of people, ankle mobility is the biggest thing stopping them from doing a pistol squat. And in a ski boot, your ankle mobility is pretty well stopped. Like
And you're supported by a ski that ensures that even if your ankle mobility is limited, you're not going to fall back on your butt as much because your heel is, I don't know, five
exactly.
feet long or whatever.
Exactly. So it just struck me
Yeah.
as something that like a little too far. And then you hear it with certain other exercises, like, you know, you should be able to do, say, like a front squat with, or you should be able to front squat like 50% of your back squat or something like that. And, or certain kind of prerequisites like that. However, I think there is something to say that, like, you know, before you start running regularly, you should be able to like hop on the spot on one foot for 30 seconds, something like that. Like, it's not necessarily a prerequisite, but maybe a test to see where you're at. If somebody can't hop on their foot for 30 seconds, I will never tell them never run until you can do this. It's maybe something that, you know, it's a test that we use. Here's something that we can work on while you work on this other thing. But I think that some people can get a little bit too strict on you're not allowed to do this movement until we've achieved A. I don't know. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think initially what you had mentioned with there being prerequisites and like movement tests and stuff like that really kind of, and we've talked about this, I'm sure, on at least a few occasions on this podcast, the viability of things like movement screens. And so I think of, let's say, do you need to be able to do an overhead squat prior to playing basketball? Or do you need to be able to do an overhead squat before you ski or run or those types of things? I think that for sure is a no. That being said, the more specific we get, the more that the data that we get from those exercises can shed some light on one's capacity. So you brought up a really great example of like single leg hopping and running. Like if someone can't single leg hop at all, just given the similarity between the just the very real stresses associated with running and the amount of time you spend on one leg, if you're really, really hard at this other one-legged thing where the forces are very similar, then that could be a potentially interesting data point that we use to structure your training. I think general movement assessments that are pass fail in nature, and we've thrown FMS under the bus, and we're going to continue to. So things like you need to be able to do these things by this standard, and if you can't, like you're a bad mover, kind of a thing, and that you need to do this and the presupposition with all of this stuff is that you need to be able to do these things so as to either perform at your highest level and or to mitigate against the risk of injury. And I would argue that it probably has more to do. It's a little bit more through the lens of injury mitigation than performance. It just seems like people talk about that a little bit more, and that just doesn't seem to be true. And then the last thing I'll say just on that is, in addition to this, like you mentioned, these movement screens don't take into account variations in one structure or anthropometry. So you look at someone who, let's say, didn't win the genetic lottery for squatting, so they have little to no forward angling or forward angle available of the shin, i.e. dorsiflexion. Maybe they have ultra long femurs, a really heavy butt, and they've got a really short torso. The amount of forward lean that person is going to require, unless they adopt a really wide stance, is going to be really significant. And
can you stop talking about me, please?
No.
With my heavy butt and long femurs.
You do have but you also have a long torso. That's what distinguishes you as well. Yeah. But you do have a heavy dumpy, for those that are curious. You can't see it on the podcast, but if you go for coffee with Brett, it's evident. It's definitely evident. But you look at something like an overhead squat, done with feet narrow-ish, relatively parallel, feet pointing forward, knees pointing forward, arms need to be essentially vertical or just shy of it. Not a lot of people can do that. Mm-hmm. Whether it be because of limitations in the lower extremity, or they just don't have, honestly, what I would say is abnormal spinal extension and or shoulder flexion to mask the fact that, that they're having trouble descending into a squat. So non-specific things like that as prerequisites and also predictors of poor performance and or injury risk, I very much disagree with. But I do think there are some prerequisites which we can get into. But before we do that, what are your thoughts on what I just said there? Do you have anything different or?
No, I definitely agree with it. I think that, this conversation starts to bleed into a little bit into like progressions and regressions. Yeah. If you've got somebody who is you're attempting, say, a clean with them, which is a pretty complicated movement. There's a lot of parts to it that happen really quickly. And if they're not able to, if they don't have the technique to the point where they're actually developing power, they're still just working on, flipping the elbows under, they're still working on getting their catch right, and they're not actually putting enough weight on the bar to promote any stimulus, then maybe you're going back to like a box jump or something else that requires something, the same sort of triple extension, but one that can be done without the same sort of focus on technique that somebody requires. So, to borrow your phrase, is the juice worth the squeeze? If you've got somebody who isn't at the point technique-wise, strength-wise, where they're getting what you want out of the exercise, then I think a regression is definitely a good idea, but that isn't necessarily like a prerequisite. Like you can still also, if I had this particular client, and I kind of do, you can still work on the clean technique probably first earlier in the workout while they're still fresh. And then you can burn out their legs doing the power exercise that actually promotes a stimulus kind of thing.
Yeah, this makes me think of, in the RTS program, they talk a lot about what's the GOTE of each individual exercise. It's GOTE or what's the GOAT? It stands for what's the goal of the exercise. Mm-hmm. And So I think what you're highlighting there is really fantastic. Like if your goal is power development, but you're constrained by skill, like the bottleneck is skill. It's
Hmm.
not power development. And so if the goal is power development immediately, that what you want to work on, but the clean is constrained by skill, then that's not a good. The exercise selection is poor for that person.
Hmm.
That being said, if you want to work towards being able to do a clean for whatever reason for this person, whether or not be because you think that that's, how would I say, the ideal movement to prioritize for that person, and or maybe they just want to get good at cleans or clean and jerk.
Hmm.
Fantastic, but don't prioritize that for your power development. Do some skill development and then work on power, because if you try to do both with that one exercise, you're only getting 50% of the
Hmm.
target, right?
Agreed. Love
The
that.
other the other piece, I think that like when it comes to prerequisites, initially we opened today with what are movement prerequisites, and which, like we mentioned, kind of brings to the forefront this conversation of assessments, specifically like pass fail ones, and their validity or even accuracy at predicting performance and also injury risk. But if we think of from a client specific perspective, is there such a thing as prerequisites? I don't think of it within the context. Sorry, excuse me. I do think there are, but it's not objective. How would I say, movement prerequisites coming from an assessment system? The prerequisites come from the client's goal, and we need to ask ourselves, what is a requirement that their body needs to be able to do for these things? And so there's context specific, like goal specific prerequisites that we could ask ourselves, um, which then for me immediately starts to go in the direction of joint function. Like for this person, let's say to do skiing, their ankles need to be able to do at least a certain amount of like context specific things for skiing, which, like you said, you're in a boot, so less than maybe a basketball player or a soccer player or something like that, because they're externally constrained. But there's a certain amount of ankle function that's required. So then the question is, do they have that from an ankle specific perspective? Then we go up the knee. What are some of the stresses associated with skiing, which is the sport we're talking about or using in this example? What are the specific like movements available at the knee that they need to be able to do, and also perhaps forces that they need to be able to tolerate? And then the same thing with the hip, the same thing with the spine, and you go from there. Like interestingly, you think of skiing. Skiing isn't a sport where you're staying in like quote unquote the neutral zone of the spine or even
What
slightly extended. Like
I
you're
mean,
flexed.
yeah, depending on the discipline, like a slalom course, you're going to be standing a little bit taller, but
Okay.
anything beyond that, like speed events,
Yeah.
your ideal position, kind of like on a bike too, is a rounded spine, so you
Yeah.
can kind of tuck under the wind.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So you look at like that's really great to know. So this person needs to be able to tolerate high loads and also be able to spend a lot of time in like whether or not it be end range or not, but a moderate to a decent amount of lumbar flexion, um, because of their sport. And
Hmm.
the prerequisites flow outwards from the goals, not flowing outwards from objective movement standards, whether they be FMS or even like I believe functional patterns has some views on this with regards to like you need to be able to do this because from a biology perspective we evolved to be able to do this, and as much as maybe there's some truth there, it all falls apart with when it comes to n of one people,
Hmm.
and personal training is an n of one profession, and so we need to derive our prerequisites from the person, not from an external system.
There's an expression that I love. It relates to people, neurodivergent people, but it's basically like if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. As in
Yeah.
like you know, a lot of people have autism or on this neurodivergent spectrum, but they're all very very different people, and it manifests very differently. Like when you're training folk, yeah, there are some basic rules that we all kind of work by, but everybody is very very different. Everybody's body is very different. How it reacts is different as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. Go ahead.
To use an example from one of my clients, I've had a client he was a very competitive golfer in university, ran into some back issues after that. He probably hasn't golfed in like 5 or 6 years, and was getting like a lot of, significant reactions from heavy workouts. So we had to regress and dial things back a little bit. And we made the plan that he wasn't going to swing a club until we could get to a point where he could get into some hip flexion and some back twisting and be able to tolerate that, feel comfortable with it, feel kind of like loose and not like his body was kind of in self-defense mode as soon as he'd get into those positions.
Mm-hmm.
Once we could do that comfortably, then he could start swinging a golf club. We wouldn't grab the driver yet, but that was kind of the movement prerequisite. But it's not like it was an objective measure that I could look at and say, okay, you're ready. To a certain extent, I could, seeing from how smoothly he's moving, but really I needed him, and I needed his words to say like, oh yeah, this feels good. Like, I don't feel like I'm really tensed up. I feel like I can move loosely and flowy. It requires a conversation. It's not just like, look at you, well, your toes aren't at the wall, so it's a no kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And what you just highlighted is what I was hoping on double clicking on. What I love about what you did with this person is you looked at what are the demands of their sport, or their, what are the demands of their goals. And then from there, you were like, right, he needs to be able to get,
Yeah.
yeah, he needs to be able to get into at least some kind of hip flexion position, and his trunk needs to be able to tolerate some kind of trunk rotation, maybe a combination of like trunk rotation, flexion, trunk rotation, and extension as a means of hitting the club.
That's exactly what we're doing.
Yeah. And so it's like fantastic. So we know that he needs that. And currently he's really guarded, and having a conversation with the client as a means of getting buy-in, of like saying, okay, let's work on this as a means of building capacity. And then from there, let's get you into your sport.
It also motivated him too, because
100%.
he didn't have a timeline for his return to sport at this point. It had been years since he was out of it, and his thought process at that point was like, I want to golf. But that was it. That was the kind of the end of it. And it's like, okay, if we work on this stuff, let's say by the start of July, we'll have you swinging a club lightly at home, not making any contact. And then in a couple weeks, maybe you can get to a driving range and start actually making contact with a ball. And then we'll incorporate the driver because it requires so much more forces. And successfully, the end of the summer, he golfed his first 18 holes in years.
Yeah, amazing.
So it worked. But, being able to go to that regression and find kind of like a pathway to his goal and add a timeline to it, suddenly it was like, oh, like this summer I'm gonna be hitting balls. It wasn't like some far off land in the future. And I think that really inspired him to work a bit on his own and put a bit more into the workouts, because he could see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, totally. So I have two thoughts. The first is, one thing that I've learned over the years, thanks to some of my friends that are teachers, is that adult learners, like, I'm not going to say need, but the vast majority of adult learners need or want to know how things build on each other. And they want to know, where am I now? Where are we going? And how are you going to get me there? It helps kind of frame things and helps the adult learner actually relax. And if we think of personal training is not just about training tissue, it is many ways about conditioning the body and the brain, i.e. teaching, so as to move people in a certain direction. And so I love that you did that. Here's where you're at, here's where you want to be, and here are some of the steps that we can get you there. And you got their buy-in. The other thing that I love that you did is you established, like, what are some of the components that this person needs to be able to do their sport. And evidently it seems like the piece that you zeroed in on, which was giving the client difficulty, was their trunk. You didn't talk about scapular protraction, retraction, and elbow motion. Right? If the person did have apprehensions with scapular or shoulder stuff or elbow stuff, a trunk protocol wouldn't have been that effective.
Hmm.
But because that was the component of this movement that the person had apprehension on, you say, okay, let's take this component aside, let's work on it, improve it, and then gradually reintegrate it into increasingly complex and or demanding tasks. And within the RTS program, big shout out again. Um, they use this idea or this term for what the nervous system goes through, the process of the nervous system of creating human movement. They use the word orchestration, and I don't know if you and I have talked about that word a lot. I know Ryan uses it on occasion because of his influence or how the RTS program influenced him. But the reason why they use the term orchestration is you think of the central conductor with the little sticks as
Hmm.
being the brain, the nervous system, and then all of the individual components that are hyper specialized, like the clarinet section, the trumpet section, the bass section, etc. They're all hyper specialized, like the body, like elbows do elbow things, they don't do shoulder things, and vice versa. And the spine is a great spine. It's not a great hip. Um, and so these areas are hyper specialized and they work together. And when they work together in this kind of orchestra example, they can either sound really great or they can sound really poorly. And similarly to an orchestra, if one area, like let's say the trumpet section, is having a real hard time, everyone else is crushing it, but there's some shitty trumpeters. And sometimes just practicing the high level song is going to be too advanced for the trumpeters to be able to increase their capacity. Like they need maybe some localized care. They need some more specific, how would I say, like strategies as a means of making them more competent. Maybe they just need to like practice their do re mi. Well, I'm not a musician, so forgive me. But maybe they need to do like scales or whatever, right? And practice, and then reintegrate. And so I think that interestingly, that's very much in one way what you did. You identified what's the weak link as of this point, and let's focus on improving that, and then gradually reintegrating it with increasingly specific things. And
I love that.
so that's great.
It agrees with my music brain quite a bit. It's like
100%.
I love the idea too. Like a conductor is never going to like roll up at the concert, meet the orchestra for the first time, be like, "Hey guys, nice to meet you. All right, here we go, first gig." Like there's a whole level of practice and rehearsal that happens beforehand before they can nail it at the show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
That's what we're doing when we're working out.
Totally. And this is actually one thing that is like a big problem with assessments is they don't take into account learning.
Hmm.
Like some people move in certain ways because that's what they've learned. That's what they've been conditioned to do. I remember I had an assessment with a woman. This was years ago now, where she was moving in a certain, and I knew this woman was hypermobile, not only from our intake but from other areas. But when she was doing squatting movements, her shin was vertical, and I kept asking her, try to go lower, try to go lower. Can you go lower? And she was like, no, like I'm stuck and I'm falling backwards. And I was just like, this is weird. This doesn't line up with everything else that I've seen. And so I asked her, and I was like, when you go down, can you push your knees further past, like, can you push your knees towards your toes or past your toes on the way down? And she was like, well, yeah. And I was like, well, why aren't you? She's like, well, I thought I didn't, I thought that was bad, you know?
Hmm.
So it's like, and so she had been, I'm not conditioned by the group fitness world that for the longest time believed that knees over toes was really, really bad for knees. And we of course know differently now. She didn't though. Right. And so she would have failed a movement assessment simply because she was moving in a way intentionally that she thought was right for her. And so there is a learning effect that happens. This is one of the things that's, you see people who do step down assessments or, what's it called? Where like you, like a depth jump,
Hmm.
uh, type of assessment where you land on the ground from an elevated surface on one leg or two legs, and you look at the motion of the knee as a means of inferring injury risk and or weakness and those types of things. And sometimes those things are associated with weakness, don't get me wrong, but there's also a huge part which is just skill. Like if you just give the client the opportunity to practice, all of a sudden they'll pass your assessment.
Hmm.
And so there's far too many issues with those assessments, let alone the fear and the feelings of weakness and fragility that they can also sow within a client, which tend to be counterproductive. And so let TLDR, not a big fan.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't need to rehash that old discussion. But
For
I mean,
sure.
it definitely some like overlapping things around like prerequisites and the whole assessment protocol is kind of buys it has to buy into that in order for it to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Now, that being said, if we were to talk about what might be some either movement prerequisites or some prerequisites that trainers should know, um, honestly, the way that I would encourage trainers to think about this is understand things from a joint by joint approach. So, study your functional anatomy, i.e., study the biomechanics of the body. What do knees do? Like, how many degrees of freedom does a knee have and why? It has two. And it has two because when it's straight, the second you start to bend your knee, the contact surface changes in such a way that you can actually rotate it in the transverse plane, not just in the sagittal. But if you look at the elbow, that's not the case because it has different joint structure. You look at the shoulder, and you can learn how it has 3 degrees of freedom and it tends to move in these ways. And so really understanding your anatomy and what are not necessarily movement prerequisites, but what is the general movement potential that each individual joint has, and what are some of its idiosyncrasies, in my opinion, is the best way to go, because then you're empowered with a better understanding of the components that you can use to kind of break things down on a client by client basis.
Can you use a real world example? Is there some time that you've used techniques like that to modify an exercise or a workout, or maybe say like you can't do this yet, so we're not going to do this exercise yet?
So I'm going to say yes to the first part, no to the second. I
Mm-hmm.
have used this kind of, I guess, biomechanical understanding as a means of informing some of the steps that we'll take, but I haven't used those things as a means of being like, oh, you can't do these things now, if not ever. It's more so just understanding joint function paves the path forward of what might be some things that we might look at as a means of helping you get to your goal.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. So an example of this, and this kind of ties into one of our next subcategories for today, which is the relationship between mobility and pain and injury. So, one thing that tends to happen when people get injured, and I'll circle back to this, when people get injured, a very, very, very common response is, and in fact, I would say this is probably greater than 98% of cases. When an area hurts and or gets injured, there's a decrease in movement variability that occurs pretty well across the board. Really great example of this is if your shoulder hurts, you're not going to like move it around in space like crazy. Generally speaking, if it hurts, you're going to hold it close to your body. You're going to support it. And so we're looking to decrease the amount of movement in total, but also the variability of that movement as a means of helping the area heal and or hurt less. And so I'm thinking back to an old client of mine who had some concerns about her knees. She had some meniscal damage back in the past. In the past, her knees were super arthritic, and as confirmed by various like scans, etc. And so the tasks that she wanted to be able to do, I believe it was a racket sport. I don't think it was tennis. I think it may have been pickleball or something like that. And so she wanted to get back to doing that, and she also wanted to be able to go up and down her stairs during her day to day without her knees hurting. And so one of the questions that I asked myself is, well, I mean, of course, what are some of the stresses associated with those demands? So keep that in mind. And then also what might be some exercises that might approximate the demands of her life and sport. But then after that, fundamentally, the first question that I had for myself was just like, well, what do knees do? And can her knee do knee stuff? Like, what's her ability to just extend her knee and bend her knee? And then what's her ability to go toe in and toe out with the knee flexed without moving her femur? Can she do that? And so that assessment of just how does your knee move at like a very kind of basic level with very little load did a few things. It gave her and I insight into whether or not she could extend and bend her knee at all was it accompanied with pain or any other kind of sensations? And interestingly, when we went through that assessment, she then realized, as I did, that she was able to do it and that she was guarding the area far more than she needed to. And so that kind of initial entry point into exercise, it was our first exercise / assessment, provided her and I really good data that she had the foundational components to be able to move into some of the positions associated with life and sport. And it also made it evident to her that there are certain things that she can do. Her life isn't exclusively can't. There are certain things that she can do. And it was one of the first steps that we took in her rehabilitative journey.
I've got
And
a couple of questions when you're ready.
yeah, fire away, man. Go for it.
One was the test that you did. Was it loaded knee flexion and extension, or were you just doing kind of like body weight, just like let it hang kind of thing?
We did. So for that one, we did it essentially as unloaded as possible. And so if I remember correctly, she was on the ground on like a yoga mat or of sorts. Her thigh was vertical and she was supporting her thigh by her hand. And I just asked her, can you straighten your knee and bend your knee? So, there's some load on the knee from like the weight of the lower leg. But other than that, that was it. And can she go into knee flexion? And then what's her ability to go into concentric knee extension?
My other question was because a lot of people are less familiar with the knee's ability to rotate or the tibia's ability to rotate. If she had given you some kind of contraindication, if she had some kind of pain or limit or just couldn't move it rotationally, how would that have changed your response to that? Like, would it have changed your exercise selection or anything like that?
Yeah, this is actually a fun. I like this is like a live case study. This is cool. So in her case, when we did it, it was like when we were looking at tibial rotation with the knee flexed at roughly 90 degrees, she was seated, heel on the ground, and I asked her just, can you turn your toe in? Can you turn your toe out? I had my hand on her lower leg, essentially near the like upper section of her shin, and as she was turning her toe out, I was looking, can you turn the lower leg towards the outside, and can you turn it back towards the inside or back to straight? And she was able to do that, which is why we progressed things. If she hadn't been able to do that, for instance, whether or not it was either just a completely blocked, or if it was accompanied by lots of apprehension and or pain, that would have definitely affected what I would have done. So if we think of, let's say, the latter option, which is when she's moving it, it's accompanied by either lots of apprehension and or a lot of pain. What I would have done, knowing that pain can be informed by a bunch of things, is I would have looked at trying to see, okay, how does her body respond as we do a little bit of this? Does she experience some pretty rapid desensitization of the knee just by extension of dipping her toes into these unfamiliar waters in a safe environment? So I probably would have kept my hands on her lower leg in the hopes of helping her feel safe and guided. And I would have been like, okay, if you bring it out in, maybe we don't go all the way. Maybe we start with just some little movements to see, can you do this? Try to find something that she's comfortable with, and then we build off of that. And so it would have been the same kind of progressions, but we would have just taken a small step, not going to say down or backwards, but we would have just regressed things a little bit more to less motion and or less speed as a means of finding an entry point that she could do and building her up. If she couldn't do that, if any movement hurt, I probably would have used or tried isometrics. So keep the foot relatively straight-ish, whatever is straight for her. And then I would have just applied a little bit of force either towards the outside or towards the inside to see, can you resist this? Because then there's torque in the transverse plane at the knee, not movement. And isometrics seem to be a really great way for areas that are really sensitive as a means of loading tissues and then desensitizing them. And then you can use that as a means of then introducing movement. So that's what I would have done with if she had been apprehensive or if it had been painful. And then if let's say she had no movement in the transverse plane, which for what it's worth, I've never seen, but let's say she had none, that would affect my expectations for how she would move in certain contexts. Specifically, anytime that there's, how would I say, deceleration in the lower extremity, one of the ways in which the body will move as a means of kind of giving us a longer runway for deceleration is with knee valgus and or pronation of the midfoot as the knee is bending. We tend to see it more in single leg activities because the knee's already, the lower leg or the leg, is already in a position of adduction. So we tend to see a little bit more of that. But also it's twice the load on each foot. So those two factors combined means that we tend to see a little bit more valgus with single-legged activities than with bilateral ones. So to answer your question, I would have had to manage my expectations and also hers of how she might move in certain contexts. Like single-legged activities might be a little bit harder for her because generally speaking, single-legged ones tend to require a little bit more tibial external rotation, which is knee valgus. So when your knee goes towards the inside, your hip will internally rotate and adduct. Your knee will externally rotate when you go into valgus. It's kind of a misconception with knee valgus. People think that the knee's turning in. It isn't. The knee's turning out as the knee goes towards the inside. And so if she doesn't have access to tibial external rotation in a relatively closed environment, like single-legged deceleration and knee valgus, I would expect her to move differently than other people.
For instance, going down a set of stairs.
Going down a set of stairs. Yeah, exactly.
Or even stopping in a racket sport.
Or stopping in a racket sport, et cetera. Yeah, exactly. And so, we would have needed to look at, once again, managing her expectations and mine, and then also looking at, okay, how can we perhaps practice novel or different ways to move? Because sometimes these things are asymmetrical also. Like maybe it's just her left leg and not her right. And if we can't actually regain tibial external rotation, which honestly actually does happen with folks who have had knee replacements, usually post-operative knees or prosthetic knees, have relatively quote unquote normal knee flexion and extension, but tibial rotation is a little bit, a little bit more limited. So maybe you would have to teach them a different way to move or land that respects their new structure,
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thanks for that answer.
Yeah, pleasure. But it once again, it kind of comes back to what we were talking about of these things, they flow outwards from an understanding of anatomy.
Mm-hmm. And understanding of your own client that's in front of you.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And using that as a means of informing the steps that you take, in contrast to square peg round hole scenarios where you try to force a protocol or a system that is not client specific onto an individual as a means of guiding the decisions that you'll make.
Mm-hmm. You brought up mobility and pain and injury. I wanted to discuss it because although it's becoming a little less discussed, when I was growing up, it was always like, you got to stretch to prevent injury. You've got to stretch to stop being sore the next day, which I think we can probably debunk most of that. But there is, I think, a relationship to performance and mobility, and a relationship to mobility and soreness and pain that a lot of people don't recognize, and I think is important, especially when working on kind of like rehab and stuff like that. So one thing I've noticed quite a bit is to not to call out somebody else, but like Squat U does it a lot, is like somebody will come in, they've got pain in this particular area, and he'll say, oh, well, this thing is tight, so if we loosen it up, it's actually going to help you out. And I think in a lot of cases that's post hoc reasoning. The thing is tight. Agreed. Likely because it hurts. Mm-hmm. And there's a big relationship between that, like protective instincts of your body to say, okay, this thing hurts, so let's tighten up everything around it so we protect it, like you mentioned before, restricting movement
100%.
and allowing less variability in movement. But then also just like delayed onset muscle soreness. A lot of people will confuse DOMs with tightness because the end ranges have a little bit of pain and discomfort in them, and they think, oh, I feel tight. But your muscles might have the same flexibility or mobility that they had yesterday. It's just the sensation is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. So I think first thing is you're totally right, and this is something that we see very, very, very often in the fitness and rehabilitation injury. People notice, because areas hurt, we then do a movement assessment. You notice things move differently, asymmetrically. There's the culprit. There's why you hurt. But what they fail to acknowledge is that usually the movement, quote unquote, dysfunction isn't a dysfunction. It's a strategy deployed by the brain as a means of protecting the area. And like we were talking about earlier, decreased movement variability, et cetera, is a really common response to pain. Also, another common response to pain is weakness.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of
Oh
the
yeah,
times,
that's another part of it too. Is they'll say, "Oh, well, this thing is weak, so if we strengthen it, that'll improve your function." And it's like, well, the thing's probably weak because it hurts.
exactly. And so, what's interesting though is that the approach usually will work. This is the thing that I think is important to highlight: is that usually, if you notice an area is really limited and it hurts, if you find an entry point into introducing movement into it that isn't threatening for the body, you can then increase mobility and range of motion. And usually with that, sensitivity will go down. But it's not because you're fixing the cause. It's because you found an entry point into movement. And it's kind of as simple as that. And
It's kind of like using the wrong formula on an exam, but still getting the right answer.
100%. Yeah. And I think especially within the fitness industry, using the right formula is really important, because if we assume that what we're extrapolating from those scenarios is this person had hip pain or back pain or whatever because they had limited hip external rotation, it's a false conclusion. If we start applying that conclusion to other people, that's damaging, or can be, not only to the people but also just to our professional progression, because we've internalized something as being true and we've perhaps inferred causation when it was really just correlated and there wasn't that causal link. And so hence why we teach, because we want to help trainers, break beyond those types of associations. So you had mentioned the thing with Squat U. Oh yeah. And the other thing that I want to touch on real quick, also just kind of associated to this, is the strength piece. Because this is another one where you'll see a lot of assessments. This area is hurting. You test an area usually related to it, and it tests weak. This is why you hurt. And then you do some isometrics or you do something else, and they get stronger and they hurt less. And it's not because necessarily you're fixing the problem, the thing that's causing the issue, but rather you just found an entry point into movement that leads to a desensitization of the system, which is far less sexy, and especially for fitness professionals who unfortunately have, I think, a savior complex as an industry. I think a lot of people do. We want to be able to. It's how would I say? It feels good to feel like we're really helping people, and or that we fixed people. And usually there isn't fixing. It usually is just creatively finding things that they can do that desensitizes their system, which is no less valuable. It's just far less mechanical than we previously thought.
The line I use often with clients is you're still climbing the mountain. I'm just your Sherpa. Like, I've been here a few times before, but what I'm doing isn't doing the work for you. Like, I'm not doing manipulations for you. I'm not I'm not doing the work for you. You still have to climb the mountain and put in the work. But I've just had the experience. That's all.
Mm-hmm, totally. Yeah. And earlier you had, kind of bringing into this, you had mentioned this kind of relationship between mobility and pain and injury. And we started talking about Squat U, and you had mentioned something else after the fact. What was the second part of that?
Yeah, it was like delayed onset muscle soreness and its relationship with mobility, or at least its perceived relationship with mobility. And a lot of people's kind of first instinct when something feels tight, because its end ranges are a little bit highly sensitized, is they'll immediately just, get into like a 30-minute stretching session. And
Mm-hmm.
like, it might make them feel better. Um, but is it, I don't know, is it the stretching itself? Is it just the fact that you're moving around? Would 10 minutes on the bike or a walk outside have done the same thing? I'm not so sure if that stretching was actually helpful, or if that tightness is damaging to performance.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I'm going to say relatively for sure, based off of my current understanding, is that stretching post exercise doesn't help with soreness. And maybe on an N of one basis, some people find that it does, which of course is, how would I say, it's messy because there's placebo, there's expectation, there's all these things. But in the literature, when they've looked at this at scale with high volumes of people, and they look at stretching groups and non-stretching groups and subjective reportings of pain and DOMs and those types of things, post-exercise stretching doesn't do anything. Now, I think the important thing is just to ask a given client, what would you like to do? And so long as you think it's not contraindicated, if they want to go for it, have at it. Like, not a big deal. But how would I say? I think that that's just an important rule to perhaps challenge in the fitness industry, that it's
Mm-hmm.
like, doing flexibility work post training as a means of decreasing DOMs doesn't seem to be a thing. That being said, if your client wants to do it and it's not damaging them, have at it. If we,
So I'll give a couple of use cases, because I do, for my own workouts and with clients, we'll often do some stretching afterwards.
sure.
I will always contextualize it with clients that, like, this isn't preventing soreness tomorrow. And I won't do it with every client, because there's certain clients I've got who are very mobile and very flexible, and they don't need any extra room. But certain ones are. And so we'll contextualize it with, we're doing this at the end of the workout because you're already tired. It's not going to do us any good to throw more squats at you. We've got some mobility goals that we want to hit. Your body's warm, your blood's flowing, and your muscles are, relaxed and ready to be stretched. Whereas if we were to try to attempt this on its own stretching day or at the start of the workout, we would have to do a full warm up to get the body ready, because that's one thing that has been, I think, indicated since I was a kid training, was that you never want to stretch cold, especially static stretches.
Mm.
Jump into like a hard hamstring stretch without warming up the muscles first. So end of the workout works out well. I also just find it a nice kind of relaxing time. You
Yeah.
get done the really hard stuff, spend 10-15 minutes lying on the floor stretching. It's almost like meditative. You just kind of like shut off your mind. You can just kind of like, feel the feelings and just kind of enjoy yourself.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. You think of like a good catalyst to like kick someone into a slightly more parasympathetic state. I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's awesome. And like, I've done that as well. Um, the other thing, so two thoughts. You had mentioned not stretching cold. So one thing that I want to just kind of talk about here. So stretching can hurt people, guys. This is something that we need to just kind of put out there. The stretching isn't non-noxious. The reason for it is that, like, we need to not forget that in the same way that when you exercise, you're imposing load on the body, stretching also imposes load on the body. It's just that the quantity and the quality of it is different. In contrast to it being intermittent, it's more consistent, but it is load nonetheless. And so you think of, one thing I've noticed over the years is that sometimes if areas hurt, folks will go do a lot of stretching as a means of hopefully forcing an area to open up or what have you. And if we were to think about this in every other context other than flexibility work, like, we wouldn't impose more load on an area that's, how would I say, either flirting with injury or is really hurting. Or if you feel like you're on the verge of throwing your back out, you're not going to go do a ton of back extensions, generally speaking. And so why is it the same thing with, because like I know for myself back in the day, this was when I was doing powerlifting semi-competitively. I was going into work on one day to do some heavy squats. I think I was supposed to squat in the fours that day, or the intent initially was to aim to go for a PR. I think the day was like 410 or 415, was around there. And I showed up with the aim of doing this, and my like right-sided SI area just was really, 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 really tight. this is many years back, so don't ask me necessarily what happened the week of, et cetera. But what's important, I think, to acknowledge is on that day I was frustrated because this is what I wanted to squat really heavy and my body just was not having it. So I grabbed a band and I did all of the Kelly Starrett stretches that I could think of, and with the hopes of trying to help that area open up. And as much as it felt good in the sense that I was putting load into the area, and that can lead to like a short-term kind of analgesic effect, my body rebelled big time against me. And I was out. Like I couldn't walk for 2 to 3 days. And I don't think that would have been the case had
Did
I
you do the
listened to
squat
the tech.
session too, or
No, not at all.
just did the warm up and then got out of there?
I did the mobility work in the hopes of helping myself feel better. I think I did like some bench, but I was feeling really shitty and I ended up just going home. Mm-hmm. And I was out. And this has happened in the past since then, where sometimes you'll feel suboptimal. And if you listen to it, you just back off acutely, give your body the breathing room that it's asking for, you can re-engage with your sport within 24 hours in contrast to 72 or 96 or even more. So I think it's an important consideration just for people to acknowledge that stretching imposes load on the body. This is like why it works. It's because of the load it imposes on the body and the subsequent adaptations that can catalyze. And so stretching isn't in its own non-noxious bubble and category. Like stretching absolutely can hurt people because fundamentally you're imposing load on tissues. The other thing that I want to just touch on really quick, because you had mentioned it earlier, Brett, was the relationship between doing flexibility when you're hurting. So flexibility work as a means of helping with DOMs. Mm-hmm. So I think that, and you mentioned, is flexibility work required or would a walk be okay? And generally speaking, what seems to be true is that the body's always like sensitivity is this very kind of calibratable thing. It changes all the time. We can modulate sensitivity with a variety of things. And the amount of sensory input that's coming in through an area seems to be a really significant modulator of sensitivity. So the amount of sensory input coming in modulates sensitivity. That sounds kind of weird, but what I'm getting at is, let's say an area hurts and you go get a massage. What the massage is going to do, not entirely, but largely, is a sensory stimulus onto your skin. All of the proprioceptive organs in muscle tissue, joints, etc., are being stimulated in a non-noxious manner. And for a lot of people, sensitivity gets calibrated down after and we feel good. But the same thing applies with like massage guns. Same thing applies with foam rolling. Same thing applies with your hands. Like if your thighs are really, really sore, if you just rub your thigh, not like massage, but you literally just stimulate the skin. I think the vast majority of people, if you just even tried that right now, I won't do it on camera because that'll look super weird. But if you just tried that, you'd likely notice that like your thigh will feel better. If there was any sensitivity or stiffness, you'll likely feel like that has been quote unquote released. But you're not changing anything with tissue. You're modulating sensitivity. And if we think of what flexibility work will do, is flexibility work is going to provide a really significant sensory stimulus to the body, which can modulate sensitivity and how would I say, provide this kind of like short to moderate term analgesic effect, which can make people feel better. So it's not so much that, oh, I'm sore, I need to stretch out tissue. It's more so like I need to provide, or I will feel better if I provide some kind of low level stimulation to the area, and that'll help the area feel a little bit better. So it's same, but different, right? It's like you can use all these tools, but we're coming at it from an understanding or an appreciation of the role of sensation on sensation, in contrast to, oh, I need to stretch this thing because now this muscle's tight and it's fundamentally problematic.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah.
If you've got a client with particular mobility goals and you feel they've got the soft tissue to achieve those goals, it's not like there's a bony limit stopping them from getting there, but they absolutely hate static stretching. Are there any other techniques you would employ to get them there?
Yeah. It's funny. I feel like this is turning into like a hot seat interview, but it's kind of fun. What I would say is honestly, just train full range of motion, right? So like if someone wants to be able to do end range, or they have a mobility goal of being able to bring their arms overhead, and passively they can get there, but actively they have trouble, I would say challenge bringing them there in various ways actively, whether it be active concentric or active eccentric.
Hmm.
Both are viable. So let's, if we use the shoulder flexion example of, actually, one of my current clients I just started working with yesterday has relatively limited shoulder flexion, and he's 72 or 78. Can't recall, but he has pretty limited shoulder flexion. And like for him, he doesn't care. But if he did, one thing we could do is we could get him laying down on his back on either a flat bench or an incline bench, and gradually bringing his arm overhead. And he's decelerating, bringing the arm overhead. So shoulder extensors are
Hmm.
eccentrically loaded to bring them here, and then we bring it back, and we kind of use that as one way. That's probably where I would start, so long as it's not contraindicated for him. And
Hmm.
then maybe you flip them over and you start working, from an inclined position, their ability to lift their arm up past horizontal and then bringing it up and kind of actively pulling into that position, in contrast to decelerating.
Hmm.
Those could be um, some strategies that honestly I use, probably variations of that far more than mobility work for clients. I just get them to move through a large range of motion that's appropriate for them. And most clients don't need a ton of stretching.
Yeah,
Um, would you agree with that? Do you do anything
definitely.
different?
No, I definitely agree with that. So one thing I tend to do when I've got larger groups, especially younger athletes, I will usually like almost always finish our workout with a big group stretch. And honestly, like the kids don't know it, but it's not really for the stretch. It's an opportunity to get us together and kind of debrief after the workout.
Yeah,
It's also an opportunity to kind of like sneakily teach them some anatomy, because I'll ask them like, oh, does anybody know what this muscle is called? What's a good stretch for that? And kind of bring it to that. So I get a bit of like crowd participation and stuff like that. And it's more for kind of like the social aspect, and some opportunity for in more learning. I will bust it out occasionally with clients if we have a bit of time at the end, or if they seem to particularly like need or want it. Specifically, clients who travel a lot, I find that like after their travel day, we'll
I
usually
agree.
cut the workout a little bit shorter. They're usually pretty beat up after that, whatever wherever they're traveling from, and then we can finish with a nice stretch, as you mentioned, get them into that parasympathetic state, relax a little bit, and just get them feeling good after a big trip.
Yeah, for sure. No, and what you just shared there reminds me of just like, even when I have clients who are traveling, usually that's the kind of stuff that we'll give them. Like their bodies are fatigued. Maybe they're not sleeping as well because it's a novel environment. They don't have their favorite pillow or their special mattress or what have you. And so
Mhm.
here's some like really low dose, not very stressful movement that you can do to just kind of help your body feel better. And we leverage that a lot during travel. It's really,
Mhm.
I'm happy we talked about this today, because this is a really, I think, important reframe on the usefulness of stretching as a means of introducing movement. But then also, like you mentioned, even at the end of a hard workout, like giving yourself the opportunity to kind of come down as a
Mhm.
means of maybe potentiating recovery, because you're giving yourself the time to settle post training. So it's like flexibility work, like you'd mentioned, and leveraging it as a means of kind of sneaking in a kind of meditative practice where people
Mhm.
will slow down, in contrast to, you know, leveraging flexibility work at the end of a workout to structurally change tissue. And I think that's an
And it,
important reframe.
if you've got a client too who's the kind of person who is like exercise to exercise, total focus, not a lot of chit chat, and like you want a moment to just kind of like connect with them, maybe debrief, maybe talk about their upcoming week, and not the moment at hand. It could be
Scheduling.
yeah, it could be a good opportunity. Like I'll usually, a lot of people spend time sitting and have some tight hip flexors. Let's just drop into a hip flexor stretch while we chat, because a lot of times those people, if they're not doing something with their bodies, they're just agitated and just getting really anxious. But if you can give them a task for their body, okay, your body's doing a stretch, and now we can just kind of talk normally. Can be nice as well.
Yeah, I agree. I love it. Well, listen, I think it feels like a good place to wrap up for today. Really appreciate you setting aside the time today. Aside, towards the end, I'm slurring my words here.
Hey, I got a good joke that'll close us off based on that.
Let's go.
How do you think the unthinkable?
How do you think the unthinkable? I'm not sure.
With an iceberg.
With an iceberg?
With an iceberg.
I feel like we need to unpack that one a little bit off camera, but
the Titanic. Come on, man. Think the unthinkable, the iceberg.
Oh, unthinkable, like the unsinkable.
Yeah.
That's funny. I like that. I hadn't understood it initially, but that's really great.
No greater compliment from a white person than no laugh and them saying, that's funny.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's I think we need to save, other than very, very obvious jokes, we need to save those for off air because they just make me look completely stupid. But no, I think I really appreciate you bringing your questions today and your insights as well from what you do, as well as your very advanced dad jokes. I hope you have a really great day, Brett. And for those that are listening, if you enjoyed today, if you learned something, please like, share, and subscribe to both our platforms on Spotify as well as YouTube. All of that goes a really long way. If you have any questions, if anything stood out that you appreciated, fire it in the comments. We get back to every single one of them individually, and it means a lot to us. Hope you guys have a really great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.